Hey everyone, and welcome to the Ingle Edit. I'm Laura Ingle, and I want to share something that I just recently took part in called the Hamptons WhoDunit. And I talked about Scott Peterson and the whole Scott Peterson case with legal expert Misty Marris. And if you know Misty Marris, she's on News Nation all the time, and she's on just about every television network there is, giving her legal expertise on many cases that we all cover. And we talked a lot about Scott Peterson and the Los Angeles Innocence Project. And we talked about an hour in front of an audience, took questions, and specifically dug into some of the parts of the LA Innocence Project and the case at hand. Now, this is a very active legal case. That's what we talked about and what you're about to see, because I'm going to share the entire thing with you right here and right now. But this week, we have a new development. The LA Innocence Project, known as the LAIP, filed a brand new petition with the California Court of Appeals, talking about new evidence they say they have that they say will prove Scott Peterson is innocent of the crime of killing his pregnant wife, Laci, and their unborn son, Connor. Now, they've been taking up this case and this cause for quite a bit. I've got some old filings here that we have gone through over the last year and a half. And what makes this so interesting is it's pretty detailed, really detailed, hundreds and hundreds of pages long, talking about what they claim is new evidence about the fetal growth of baby Connor. And that's going to come into play in a future episode, which we'll tell you more about. And also within this document that was filed, we see some pictures in a declaration from Scott Peterson himself, where he takes us through the entire day before, day of that Laci Peterson went missing. And he actually shares photos that were in evidence and other photos that the LA Innocence Project has about the case. And one of the things that you'll see in this video that I'm about to share with you from the Hamptons WhoDunit is Detective Albro Keeney talking about his perception of how the crime occurred. And he takes us through, in a piece of video that I took during an interview, how he thinks Laci Peterson died. And he basically talks about it happening in the bedroom. And you can see here, this is a picture taken from evidence that was shown in court of the Peterson's bedroom and the bed. So you'll see him talk about that. Also, within the declaration from Scott Peterson, we see a cadaver dog inside the home, which Scott Peterson says was brought into his home shortly after Laci Peterson disappeared. And he says that cadaver dog never alerted in the house. Another thing that he puts in his declaration is this toolbox that he has in the back of his pickup truck. And he claims that he had this cardboard box and some other gear in this box in the back of his pickup truck, which, as we know the story, police believe he loaded Laci Peterson's body into the back of the truck from their home on Christmas Eve 2002 and drove her to the San Francisco Bay, where they believe he dumped her body. But what we hear in this declaration is that he tells us and he tells the court that the items that were in that toolbox, specifically a cardboard box, were not ever tested. And the detective that handled that, Detective Grogan, he claims, doesn't know where that box is. It was never tested for anything. And then they show pictures of a pregnant woman who worked for prosecutors getting into the box. You can see it right here. They used this at trial. And he talks about that in his declaration. One other thing I want to mention that I found so interesting was a picture of a flip-flop, a depiction of a flip-flop that was found near the Petersons' home. Laci Peterson kept a pair of flip-flops that looked similar to this in her house that she would put on when she would go outside. And as the defense theory goes, Laci Peterson went out across the street from her home on Christmas Eve after Scott Peterson went fishing and left his home in his truck to go get his boat. And the defense claims that she encountered these burglars across the street and somehow disrupted them, confronted them, and they believe that somehow she did get kidnapped and she was taken somehow, possibly in a van. And there's this flip-flop that was found at the end of the street, and he details it here in this declaration. and talks about how it was actually a judge that lived on their block that found the flip-flop. So other details contained within this very large filing from the Los Angeles Innocence Project. But mostly what I want to talk to you about today is what took place in the Hamptons with Misty Marris. She has a podcast, M&M in the Mornings. You can find it here. Look everywhere for your podcasts, so you can find the M&M podcast and check her out with Mercedes Cohen. So here we go. This is what happened at the Hamptons WhoDunit 2025, my discussion with Misty Marris. All right, you guys can hear me in the back. I heard some, yes, I can see the hands. Hello, everybody. I'm Laura Ingle. Thank you guys so much for being here today to Unfaithful, Accused, and Convicted, the case against Scott Peterson and the Scott Peterson case. And the reason why this title was chosen is because way back when we were going through learning about this story, I put together a radio piece. I was a radio reporter at KFI in Los Angeles covering this story. And he was unfaithful and accused. We had just found out about Amber Fry, a woman that he was having an affair with. And that's kind of the evolution. And it's really interesting, just a really quick story. I had wanted to cover this story living in Los Angeles. I'm from Sacramento, which is very close to Modesto, California, where this all took place. And I went to my news director and I said, we have a missing woman. Now, we have a lot of missing person cases as reporters. And it was obviously something that struck me. I think this is a story that struck everyone just to start with this image of a beautiful, beaming woman who went missing on Christmas Eve, 8 months pregnant. It was something that needed to be covered. And we actually got into a fight. He said, this is Modesto, Laura, it's gonna blow over. Don't worry about it, we've got other things to do. And I said, we have to cover this story. And here we are over 20 years later, still covering this story. Yeah. And I'm so glad that Misty Marris is here with us today, ladies and gentlemen. Misty Marris is a sharp legal mind who lives locally and is on national television, just about every network you can imagine.
Well, and to Laura's point, you were right with your editor, because blow over the story did not.
It did not.
And Laura and I work together all the time at News Nation, just top-notch host, top-notch reporter. And then I covered the legal aspect, and we were actually sitting together the day that Scott Peterson's application came from the Los Angeles Innocence Project. So now it's really fun to be up here going deep dive, going back, and then we'll figure out where we are today.
Right. This has been a crazy road. How many people here in this room have been following this from the beginning, 2002? Right. So you saw the image, and it escalated very quickly, right? We watched the despair, and we watched the anguish and the fear from Laci's family. And that's what really grabbed us, right? And a lot of people have asked me through the years, why this story? Why did this story get so big when there's so many other missing person cases? And it always just depends on the news cycle, quite frankly. It depends on what's going on. It was a slow news cycle during that time. It was Christmas, end of the year. But then we had this dynamic and this picture that really led so many people to want to get involved and help with the search and begin the process of figuring out what could have happened. How does a pregnant woman go missing on a walk in her neighborhood on Christmas Eve? So as we move through the story, and we'll go to the next slide, because we see this, so I want to show you what she looked like pregnant. Everybody probably remembers this photo. This is Laci Peterson, very pregnant, and just an adorable person that so many people loved, and is why everybody was drawn to the story. And then we move through the story in the search to find her. And as the story progresses, we start seeing pictures of her life, and we see her at a Christmas party in a red pantsuit. And what's striking about this photo and in this moment in time, December 9th, 2002, is that she is alone. She is alone at this Christmas party. Her husband can't be with her. And it turns out he had, as we now know, a completely different life going on, but it was a short life. A lot of people have the misconception, Misty, that Scott Peterson and the woman he was having an affair with, Amber Fry, was this torrid, long, years-long affair. They actually went on about 4 dates. 4 dates. Right. So, to the defense's part, they argued at trial, this was not, a motive. They didn't think that Amber Fry was a motive. We'll get into that. But when you look at the next photo of Scott Peterson with his
woman who's having an affair with Amber Fry, this is the same night. That's where he is. So he's miles away attending a Christmas party with Amber Fry. She has no idea, by the way, as we now know, she has no idea that he is married. So Misty, as we learn this part of the story, I mean, this is what everybody grabbed onto, right, for motive. How did you see it?
Well, an interesting part that I think in a trial, prosecutors actually never have to prove motive, which many people don't realize. But it sure does help the jury to hear the why, especially when you have a story like this, a pregnant woman killed at the hands of her husband. So putting this together, as far as a motive, even though there's 4 dates, okay, maybe it's a motive, maybe not. The jury doesn't even have to make that decision. But Amber Fry blows this case wide open.
She does. She does. And as we take a look at, this is December 9th, then we move forward to just past Christmas Eve. And you might remember that there was a vigil. And we go to the vigil in Modesto, where the entire town turns out, and we see the large scope of how many people are out there. And if you know the story, and if you don't, I'll share it with you. During this vigil, when everyone is so desperate to find Laci Peterson, what happened, there's flyers out there, there's a thing that happened at the Red Lion Hotel, which was the command center where everybody came. We now know that Scott Peterson snuck away. You'll go to the next slide and you'll see him. There he is. He is at the vigil, but he kind of goes away. He makes a phone call. He calls Amber Fry and says that he's in Paris. He is excited to see her when he gets back. He can't wait to be with her again. And the lights are so beautiful. And it goes on. And it's devastating during the trial.
Right, and for the prosecution, they can sit there and say, is this the way that you act when your wife and unborn child are missing? That you're at her vigil, talking to a woman, and here's where I think the 4 dates comes in handy, that you've only been on 4 dates with. And this is what you're doing. And so looping that in to the narrative from the prosecution's perspective, the jury is going to sit there, and by the way, jurors are told, do not leave your common sense at the door of that deliberation room. They're told you're going to be analyzing the law and the facts through the eyes of your own experience. And sit there, every juror, and think to yourself, how would you act if your wife and unborn child were missing and you were at their vigil? And that is something that was devastating to the defense. That narrative really was something that the defense did not and was not able to overcome.
So we move through this, and I think there's one more slide showing Scott Peterson. I think he's with some family members there. It showed a very stark difference. When you see Sharon Rocha, the mother of Laci Peterson, and her family members, they are just ashen. They are just devastated. You can see that they haven't slept, they haven't ate. And then you do see Scott Peterson here in a very different light. I don't know, what is he thinking? What is he thinking? I don't know if, he's obviously convicted of a double murder of his pregnant wife and their unborn child, Connor. And you just go back to these photos during that time and the interviews he gave that were so strange. What did you make of the interviews that he did with Diane Sawyer, he did with 3 Locals, he did Ted Rollins of CNN?
This is why any defense attorney will tell their client, don't talk. Do not say a word. Sit back, talk to me. You need to tell your story, talk to me, because it's shrouded in attorney-client privilege. Because every single one of those interviews has the opportunity to come back into the courtroom and feed into that prosecution's narrative of, is this how a husband whose wife is missing would act under the circumstances? And looping that in with every act he takes after Laci Peterson's disappearance, it was devastating to the defense. And those interviews were a large part of it.
They were, and they were played at trial. I attended every day of this trial, which was very hard to get into. And if you followed this case, you know the media circus that it was. It was, this is in the O.J., Michael Jackson, Scott Peterson era, where this was just on TV all of the time. And when I was covering this case, it was actually very hard to get into the courtroom because I wasn't a national reporter and I wasn't a local reporter. Those are the two types of reporters that got access. I think we have a picture of, I wanted to show you the press passes that we had to get every day, and I've got them scattered on I have everything. I'm a pack rat. I hold everything up in the attic.
You need a whole other home. Just
I
to keep
do,
all of your-
I do, but see these press seating passes, you can see them here. I just wanted to share those with you because I had to stand in line every day for a public lottery to get them. And then take turns with the press seating. But the public lottery, you had to get out there early in the morning before the sun came up, stand in line outside of the courthouse and get a carnival ticket. And I went into one of those, gold cylinders, and they would draw the numbers, and if you won a ticket, you got a seat in the courtroom that day. So if you wanted to be in the courtroom to report on it, that's what you had to do. And it truly was an absolute circus when that happened. But we wanted to give you the background and remind everybody of the case because this is now, we're back talking about it because it's actually a very active legal case. We've been going through appeals, we've been going through back and forth with the death penalty, but now we've got the Los Angeles Innocence Project involved in Scott Peterson's case, which is different than the Innocence Project. A lot of people are like, the Innocence Project is involved. What? It's actually a different chapter, so to speak, right?
So it's two completely different entities, but with the same mission. So the Innocence Project has been around for 30 plus years. It's obviously a very prestigious organization that's had great success. The Los Angeles Innocence Project was formed in 2022, and it was funded tremendously in order to pursue forensic science and to take cases where forensics may have been at the early ages of where they can actually be linked to somebody. The technology has changed, the methodology has changed. Not only that, as time goes on, there's more individuals who are identifiable in the databases that the investigators, police, FBI uses. And so the Los Angeles Innocence Project had a large grant, and it was specifically to pursue cases where forensics really matter. And they had a great deal of success of overturning convictions where there was what I'll call dispositive, meaning on the money DNA matches to others that were not convicted of the crime. And in fact, the person that started the Los Angeles Innocence Project was somebody who was wrongly convicted and took part of the money in a settlement against the county and used it to fund this type of work. So it's an incredible organization.
Yeah.
They don't take every case though. And so the fact that they picked this up means they believe there's something credible to the counter argument of Scott Peterson's guilt.
Yeah, and as we've been moving through this, I mean, for me, going back, and for all of us that have covered the case, there's a group of reporters that have been doing this for over 20 years. We're back at the very same courthouse. We're in a different courtroom, but it's wild to go back to this courthouse. It is deja vu. We're back there, standing, going through the same mags, going through the security, going up the escalator, and you might remember that very famous scene where Amber Fry is coming down the escalator with Gloria. It's the same courthouse, and it's the same scenario. I don't know if we can switch over to the video, but one of the things that I also wanted to share with you, just to go back in time for just a second, as we know, and it's really wild, Misty, I was looking at the calendar because we're going to go to the Point Isabel one. It's really wild because it was April 13th and April 14th, next week, Sunday, Monday, that Connor and Laci were found in 2003.
That is very eerie.
So we're right around that time. So I've done a couple of documentaries on the Scott Peterson case. I hope the volume will play on this. I want to set this up for you for just a second because for anybody who doesn't know, the story goes is that Scott Peterson went fishing on Christmas Eve 2002. He tells his family that, and he leaves Laci Peterson. He says that she is going to be walking their dog when he was leaving. That's what was going on. And it's really crazy because the Berkeley Marina, which is in San Francisco, the San Francisco Bay, is very far. It's about 90 miles, and it takes a while to get there. So it's kind of weird that somebody would drive that far on Christmas Eve to try and get to the bay, to put their boat in the water, to try it out. But that's what he says he did. Except for, I will tell you, I interviewed a person that lived right across the street and one down when she was missing, because I was on the street when all of this was happening, and she told me that Scott Peterson told her that he had been playing golf that day. So there's that.
Another inconsistency.
Right. So anyway, it's all been, when you hear about Laci Peterson and her unborn child washing ashore right where Scott Peterson says he went fishing. A lot of people say that draws a straight line. And I've been covering it for a long time, and the last time I went to the Berkeley Marina, Point Isabel, this is on the San Francisco shoreline, I wanted to show you exactly how close everything is, because we see the aerials, you've seen the photos and the videos of Laci's body being walked up that pathway, if you know the story. Hopefully this plays, but I want to just show you kind of how close everything is, and I'll show you in this video, but you see that mound behind me? That's Brooks Island. And that is, and Berkeley Marina is going to be over here. Laci's body washed ashore over here. I'm going to show it to you now, but just so you know, for point of reference, that's Brooks Island, and that's how close it was to the rocky shoreline, if we could play it. We're in Point Isabel, California. We're on a shoot here for a Scott Peterson special, and I just want to show you around where we were filming. This probably looks familiar to you. This is the road and path that the coroners took when they brought Laci Peterson's body from the rocky shoreline up into the van. It happened right here. And then right in this distance behind me is Brooks Island. That is where Scott Peterson said he was fishing on December 24th, and probably did take his boat out this way. And you can see the distance is not that far from the island to the rocky shoreline. And then Connor's body washed up over there on that shore, and behind me is the Berkeley Marina behind that piece of land. So we'll bring you. So I just wanted to give you a perspective, because, you know, unless your boot's on the ground and you're there, it's really interesting to see it. And that's, you know, the defense has said, look, they knew that Scott Peterson, you know, the burglars across the street or a third party who may have taken Laci, knew where he had gone fishing. So that's why they put the body there, because that's where he said he was. How unlikely is that?
So this is the really interesting part about a case where you're talking about a missing person from Christmas Eve until April, which garnered such intense media, including those interviews with Scott Peterson, is that the defense was able to take some of that and weave it into their own counter-narrative, which was there was a burglary that happened on the street where Laci was, and that somehow she either interrupted it, wrong place, wrong time, and she was a casualty of that. And to explain how the body would be in the marina where Scott Peterson's boat, you know, wash up in that area, the defense needs to explain that, because as Laura said, that sounds like a straight line to most people, including the jurors. But the defense said Scott Peterson was doing these interviews all the time, and he was saying where he was. And so when the robbers and their affiliates needed to get rid of the body, they thought, aha, we'll get rid of it there, because it will inevitably be tracked back to her husband.
Right. And remember, these are people who broke into a house, and there was a significant amount of items that were taken out of the Medina home. The Medinas were a family that lived across the street from Scott and Laci Peterson, and there was a wild discrepancy about when this burglary took place, because they left on Christmas Eve. They left in this time period, and there was a lot of back and forth, but the prosecutors will tell you had nothing to do with it. The defense still today is arguing that part of the LA Innocence Project. They're saying this needs a second look.
Yes, it's actually a central part of the defense argument, which we'll get into in a little bit about what the LA Innocence Project is actually looking to review. But it's a central part of their narrative as to why this conviction should be overturned.
So we've got a couple of different things. If we can talk about what the LA Innocence Project is working on to bring it to current, because we've got the burglary that is so important. We've got a lot of people, the LA Innocence Project says, we've got like 50 people in this neighborhood who swear they saw Laci Peterson after Scott Peterson went to the Berkeley Marina. I've interviewed a couple of them, and I'll tell you, I thought, oh, this is gonna be, I don't know, not nothing, but they are convinced, absolutely convinced, that they saw Laci Peterson after Scott went fishing. The dark hair, the pregnant belly, Mackenzie, the outfit, the route, they swear that she was seen.
And all of that is part of what the LA Innocence Project is seeking to review. So there were two different legal motions that were made before the court. A motion means we're asking the court to do something. One related to forensic testing, and we'll get into that. The other directly relates to this, discovery, which is the process by which both sides exchange information. So what the LA Innocence Project asked for was 60 categories of information, documents relating to the investigation of the burglary and other areas, but primarily focused on the investigative efforts relating to that burglary back in 2002. And they're getting a lot of that. And they're going to be able to review it, which includes some of these witness statements about sightings and other statements that were taken by law enforcement at the time, which were not in possession of the defense attorneys when this case went to trial.
And what about the evidence too? So the evidence, the hardcore evidence, as we all watched the evolution of the story from Laci's disappearance to learning about Amber Frey, and as we moved through, it was a lot of circumstantial evidence which led us to this conviction eventually. But there was only one piece of true physical evidence in this case, and we have a picture of it, and you have to kind of squint to see it. It was a pair of pliers that were found in Scott Peterson's fishing boat that had a DNA match to Laci Peterson's hair with mitochondrial DNA, and you can't even see it, but that is the one piece of physical evidence in this case. Everything else, Misty, is circumstantial, which still counts.
Absolutely. So we live in this CSI world, especially now, where juries really, really like to see the forensics. But even still, circumstantial evidence, I watch these documentaries all the time, say, it's just circumstantial evidence, ringing the bell. It's not true from the legal perspective. Circumstantial evidence and direct evidence are the same from the perspective of the courtroom. It's the same. They're given the same weight. And when you're talking about the difference between the two, direct evidence is you have an eyewitness who saw this individual. You have a picture of their face as they're committing the crime. You're talking about evidence, no wiggle room evidence, for lack of a better word. Circumstantial evidence and the instruction that's given to the jury is if we're sitting in this room and you can't see outside, no windows, everything's blocked. And then you see people coming in with galoshes, with wetness on them, with umbrellas, shaking their umbrellas off. You can draw the conclusion that it's raining outside. And that's the example that's given to the jury. So when you think about all of the evidence that you were just laying out, especially Scott Peterson and the way he acted, what he said, his words, Amber Frey, the jury is able to take all of that and draw a reasonable conclusion from the evidence presented. And it's the same legal weight as direct evidence.
And so many people talk also about he made cement anchors in his warehouse. There's a lot of different things that happen as we move through this case that all added up to the jury. It was a 5-month trial that got us to the double murder conviction.
Yes, and he's leaving town. He's got the clothes. He's got money on his person.
Right, running for the border. He says, no, I was just going to go play golf with my family in San Diego with dyed his hair, yes, to avoid the media, is what he said. All that cash that he got from his mom because he was selling a car, his brother's ID because he might need that. But there was a lot going on. But it's still up for debate today. That's what makes this case so interesting. This isn't over. We're 20 years in, and we're still talking about a chance with the LA Innocence Project. They have cracked the door. When this first happened, and Misty and I were in the newsroom at News Nation, we were talking about it, and I was like, I don't know, is this gonna have a chance? This judge gave this case a chance. They cracked the door to the possibility with some of the testing that's gonna be done, that has been done.
They absolutely cracked the door open, and we were sitting there, and we were getting, our production assistants were bringing us pages and pages of documents. They're printing it as it's being filed on the docket. And what the judge did was respond to each set of issues. First, one set of issues is retesting of evidence that was collected during the initial investigation. The defense, Innocence Project, asked for 16 pieces of evidence to be tested. Only one is being tested. A 15.5 inch piece of duct tape that was found on Laci Peterson's person. Now, this has actually been tested back in 2013 as it relates to 2 hairs that were on the duct tape, and they were identified to be a genetic match to Laci. But now the testing is going to go further on this piece of duct tape because technology has improved so significantly by 2025. So that testing has actually been completed. The results of the testing are under seal. The only people who know that result, LA Innocence Project and prosecutors and the judge. The other relates to the discovery. We talked about this before. So there's the physical evidence that's being retested, and then there's the documentary evidence. Defense was successful on 45 of their asks. They asked for 60. And much of that relates to the burglary, the investigation of the burglary, and other witness statements and that were collected at that time. So all of that is going to be in the possession of the Los Angeles Innocence Project. From there, we don't know what they're going to find, whether or not that's going to lead to a further inquiry. But the judge did open the door for this application, because the legal standard, this is an important framework to understand what's going on here. There's been appeals before. He tried to overturn his trial shortly after he made a motion to overturn the verdict. He had an immediate appeal when you're sentenced to death. Immediately, there's an automatic appeal of your sentence that goes through the appellate courts. Then there's what's called the habeas corpus petition. Release the body is what it means. It means that somebody is imprisoned and they shouldn't be. And that habeas corpus petition included some prior requests for additional testing and additional information. So all of that's already happened. But now, the standard that the Los Angeles Innocence Project must reach is that there's new evidence that was not presented at the initial trial. That could be true. We know that some evidence was actually held back, was never given to the defense. But the second piece is the reason why you rarely see jury verdicts overturned. And that's because not only do they have to show there's new evidence, it has to matter. And the definition of matter is that a reasonable jury would not have convicted. So think about that language. Everything in the law matters what the language is. They would not have convicted but for this new evidence. So that is a very high standard. It can't be, well, they might have thought differently. Well, it could have been a hung jury. Maybe some would have bought the defense theory. It has to be that a reasonable jury would not have convicted. And that's why you see with the Innocence Project and the Los Angeles Innocence Project, a lot of these cases get overturned on that dispositive DNA connection. But all of these other elements are not going to be enough on their own.
So why don't we know the results of this testing? This is driving me crazy. I thought we were going to be back in Redwood City going to court and hearing, ta-da, the evidence. Why aren't we hearing it?
I know, and we've been waiting because that was completed as of December that had been completed. But it's all up to the judge, and especially in a case where you're talking about all eyes on this case, just as much as it was back in 2004.
Right.
We're all looking at it. It's just as much in the news cycle now. I suspect that the judge is going to wait for that discovery and documentary process to be completed. Because remember, those are two separate motions that were made before the court. And we're probably going to see the results and what comes next once that process is done. And we're going to hear about it all together.
I ran into Dr. Michael Baden, who you all know, this week in New York City, and he and I had been on Fox a long time together covering Scott Peterson, and I said, Dr. Baden, is there a chance that, what are we going to find out in this duct tape? If a piece of duct tape has been in the salt water in the San Francisco Bay for this long, what are the chances we're going to have something? Because, if Scott Peterson's thumbprint is in it, then he's got a problem. But could it show something else? He said it's tricky. He said, but duct tape is really interesting. Duct tape holds so much evidence, and to Misty's point, the technology, the advancement of what we're talking about, we could truly find new information that is held in this duct tape. Salt water causes some trouble, but what do you think?
Well, I think Dr. Baden, if I know him, he said to you something like, water changes everything.
Yes, he did, actually.
He says that. We both work with him quite a bit. Listen, we could find something, but what is that something? And will it satisfy that very high standard of does it matter? And the question is there another thumbprint on it? Is there a fingerprint?
What if it's one of the burglars from across the street?
If it's one of the burglars from across the street,
Todd
now
Pearson's.
we're talking.
Yeah.
Now we're talking. Now we've got a very viable legal theory that could really change the game. But if it's unidentified DNA of another male or of anybody else that can't be connected from the perspective of opportunity, then it's likely to not be enough to satisfy that standard. And so it really depends on what those results are. Keep in mind with forensics, and you'll learn a lot more about this from Joseph Scott Morgan, JSM, as we call him, or you know, the other forensic experts here today. But there's this law of transference. So it's every contact leaves a trace. So that duct tape, there could be DNA, anything on that duct tape that, yes, it's there, but it doesn't necessarily mean there's any tangible connection,
Right.
which would satisfy the standard.
So we've got that, and we've got the LA Innocence Project that's working so hard to get Scott Peterson a new trial. Also working so hard to get Scott Peterson a new trial is his family. Janie Peterson. How many people here have seen a documentary with Janie Peterson in it? She is his sister-in-law and has really been leading the charge. Actually went to law school after he was arrested and convicted. She says, I didn't do it just for him, but she did it to really get a better understanding. And I have been trying to get in touch with Janie Peterson and get her one-on-one for a really long time because I had heard she had a war room in her family business. And if you've seen Homeland with the, you know, the corkboard and the strings and everything, we can show that picture. That's the next picture on the slide. There you have it. So here we are in the war room. This is Janie Peterson. So her family has a business in San Diego, and this is in one of the offices that they have kept up for a long time. Look at all these boxes here. Those are all the discovery. And behind the camera also is just stacks and stacks of boxes. And there's more corkboards here. So there's actually 3 walls that have this kind of thing. So everything you see on the left is something that Laci Peterson did that day. Everything you see on the right, see the blue border around it? Those are things that Scott Peterson did. And right in the middle is the clock that ticks on that day of every single thing that took place. And it's hard to see, and I'm sorry I don't have a closer picture, but up there above her head you see Laci Peterson, and to the right is one of the burglars of the Medina house from across the street. So I just wanted to show it to you because I thought it was so interesting that they spend all this time in this room talking about how the time in their mind shows that there is no way that Scott Peterson could have done this. There is no possible way. She is convinced. She is trying to convince me standing here. It was a thing. Like I kept going back at her, going back and forth, but what about this? What about that? Everything that we've all known. And she will argue you down to the 13th hour on this. She definitely, and her family, believes that there is a chance that they can get him out. So as we move through this, and the clock on here has to do with the timing of when the family dog was found. Mackenzie, Scott and Laci's dog, was found wandering around without a leash. Clearly, she was taken, according to Scott Peterson. And the timing of the mailman. That's another important part of the LA Innocence Project. You brought that up as we were talking before we came out here.
Yes, so there's a whole narrative from the defense perspective that Scott Peterson was gone. He'd already gone fishing by the time that Laci Peterson was, according to them, abducted by somebody, taken by somebody. And some of the evidence relates to tips from neighbors who, as you said, they swear that they saw her after that time. That the mailman says, every time I went to the Peterson house, the dog would go nuts, the dog would be barking. Heard nothing that day. And the conclusion was that, okay, well that means she was still out walking the dog. And Scott's already gone. So they're trying to take out the element of what is so important in every trial, opportunity. If the defense can show that Scott was not there and Laci was still alive, well that narrative certainly changes everything. And they're focused on some of those witness statements in order to do so.
I mean, what's happening here in this photo, and we're talking about the timeline, she's convinced that there is just not enough time to kill somebody, to load somebody, to drive somebody, to hide somebody, to get it. Could you just not believe it? I mean, couldn't we have had Ring cameras back then? Things would have been so, every time I hear the witness statements, I just think, my goodness, if there was just even a camera at the gas station when he turned right and went to the San Francisco Bay. There was just such a lack of that type of technology.
Now if you walk by anyone's house, you're going to be captured at some point.
So I don't know about you guys, but haven't you always wondered in going through this case, because we've never known the where, the how, and the exact when. Those are the questions that we just haven't heard, and there's no actual evidence that we really know of how that happened. Another piece of video I want to show you, if you can cue it up. I've got a video of Detective Al Brocchini. You've probably heard about him. He was on the case from the beginning. And I did, oh, is it gonna not be there? Oh, there he
And
is.
so my opinion is she's sitting on the end of the bed, taking her shoes off. He's either behind her or in front of her, bags her or just strangles her, and she scratches him. And then there's right here, right there, there's blood on the duvet. Okay, so it's his blood, it's his duvet. Could have got there any way he wanted, but that's just my opinion. And then he rolls her up in the blue tarp, drags her right through that door in the back where the rug's all scrunched up, puts her in the truck. Somebody sees him. Now he's got to put something else in the truck, make sure it's in a blue tarp, and takes her to the shop. And my guess is puts her, now that's those shops.
I think it shuts off right there. So I was in the middle of an interview and I was just trying to slyly take some video on my own iPhone. I always try and take my own stuff. And I was just asking him, I said, Detective Brocchini, how, that's his theory. And he says, that's my opinion. Because there is no smoking gun. There is no blood scene. There's no blood spatter. There's no, all the things that we would talk about unless it's a soft kill.
Absolutely, and that is part of why the defense had an opening and some vulnerability. And at the original trial, they mentioned the burglary, they talked about that, but what they presented was a third-party culprit defense, or as we call it colloquially, the Shaggy defense. It wasn't me. So they presented that, but multiple theories, okay? So they presented multiple theories of what could have happened to Laci Peterson, because guess what? The prosecution couldn't really say. So that fills in a gap. But what happens sometimes when you do that as a defendant at trial? The prosecutors have the burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. You're going to hear that phrase so many times this weekend. And the burden doesn't shift to the defense. It's always the prosecutors. The defense is just trying to muddy the waters, create doubt. Say there's an alternative scenario that could have happened. But sometimes you unwittingly do put that burden on yourself because the jury wants to know more. They want to know more about the specifics. The defense can raise a third-party culprit. They don't have to prove that they did it. But the jury oftentimes wants to hear more than just, well, this could have happened or that could have happened. And when we speak about it, if they were to be successful in this bid to get a new trial, you might hear a more detailed account of that alternative theory.
I know that I see Luis over here, which means we're rounding third. I can't believe it. It goes so fast.
So fast.
It goes so fast. And really quick before we get to questions, if we go to the next slide, this could be a red herring. I don't know if you guys have heard about the orange van, but all along from the beginning, there was talk of a van across the street from Scott and Laci's house. This is going to go into play as we move through this next phase of the story, as we go through the LA Innocence Project. When there was this burglary across the street, at first it was a tan van, then it was a white van, then it was a brown van. Then all of a sudden, fast forward to where we are today, turns out there was an orange van, probably a separate van, but nonetheless, it's a van that was found fully engulfed in flames 1 mile away from Scott and Laci Peterson's house, Christmas morning. And we don't have the next picture, but there was a mattress in the back that had what looked like blood stains. Turns out that stuff has been tested, and some of it has been lost apparently, but it's not going to come into play.
No, it's not coming into play. The judge said we're not retesting the mattress in the van. That's off limits. There had been prior testing that had found that there was not blood on it. So that's where it stands. The judge said no. However, investigative materials relating to this orange van is being turned over on that discovery side. Remember, we talked about we've got the testing side, the discovery side. So the Los Angeles Innocence Project is going to get information about that investigation as relates to the van. And they're also going to get the DOJ, so that's the federal government, conducted a forensic analysis relating to that mattress and the van. They're going to get those records, even though they can't do the testing again.
Right. So I mean, when this
not out for the count, but it's certainly not what they wanted.
I mean, man, when this happened, when you guys heard about this, right? When you first heard about it, and you saw the back of the van and the burned out gas can and what looked like a bloody mattress. It's like, how did that not get turned over?
Right, and in addition to that, Laura, and I think this is really important because these are other witness statements that were not turned over. There was a neighbor who called on December 28th, so days later, and said, hey, I want to report that I saw a pregnant woman being pushed into a van. Okay, so that didn't go to the defense. There was also, they call it the Aponte tip. So it was a corrections officer who heard chatter in the jailhouse that Laci Peterson, so this is a year later, this is 2023, or 2003, that Laci Peterson intervened or was in the wrong place at the wrong time at the burglary. So there's other witness statements that were never turned over to the defense that link up to this theory of, was it a brown van or white van? Oh, it's an orange van. Well, that's a little bit more conspicuous.
Right.
And that's all part of what the Innocence Project seeks to do to overturn that verdict. And quite frankly, unless there's forensics, the other avenue where there is the possibility of success, because as we said, just more evidence of the third-party culprit theory that was already set before the jury, probably not going to do it, just muddying the waters. But what was not turned over is what's called a Brady violation. It means that there's exculpatory evidence in the possession of prosecutors that a reasonable person would think is positive for the defendant. And so that is an avenue that is being pursued, and certainly something that the defense would want to know. Imagine that opening statement. Laci Peterson intervened in a burglary. We have a witness who says that he saw her after Scott Peterson went fishing. We have a witness who says he saw a pregnant woman being pushed into a van. We have an orange van on the street. Guess who doesn't want you to hear about it? The prosecution, because they only have eyes for Scott Peterson. So, I mean, chills, right? Because it changes the whole narrative. But will it matter? And that's really the big question as far as what we find out.
Well, we're going to be in court. We're going to find out. Last slide I want to show you, and you mentioned the word verdict. I just want to show you as I close, before we take pictures. This picture framed in the hallway of that courthouse I told you about in Redwood City. It was such a mob outside when the verdict was rendered and reached. We were in the very, very back of this long building. And when the verdict was reached, I could hear, it sounded like, I was like, is there a football game? What is happening? It was so loud. And this is what was happening outside. This was the crowd, the mob mentality that Mark Garagos talks about. There was a mob mentality, he says, and this is what it looked like the day that we had the verdict. People with transistor radios, you can't make it up, hearing the verdict and cheering so loud it felt like it shook the building. So we'll see if we're going to get back to another trial or not.
Can you imagine? I mean, that will really be something. And just referencing Mark Garagos, Laura and I are friends and colleagues with Mark, and so we reached out to him. And he said, the Los Angeles Innocence Project is doing amazing work on this case, and I hope that Scott has a chance at freedom.
And there you have it. And I think we'll take questions, sure. Anybody have a question?
Yeah, so the robbers, I don't remember, were they captured and if so, were they ever known to be violent and hurt killers have that in their wheelhouse?
So this is where it gets a bit interesting, because the robbers confessed to the robbery. Yeah. And they had,
right away.
Yes, right away. And they had alibis for the time frame which prosecutors say Laci Peterson was killed. And so the theory is that it wasn't the actual robbers themselves, and that they were part of a bigger criminal network committing robberies, and that basically she was taken by them and ultimately killed by others who were affiliated.
Yeah, Modesto is known as murder, meth, and auto theft, unfortunately for Modesto. But that they were
not
part
a great
of
rep.
Not a great rep. A lot of violence in this one area where the two burglars did live, in what's known as the airport district. And so there's like this, this real gang activity kind of, everybody works together, knocking over homes, robbing people, and then getting the money for methamphetamines and stealing cars. Back there?
So you had mentioned that there's the new evidence from the duct tape under sealed bid. The fact that this is still going on with the Los Angeles Innocence Project, is that suggesting that it is going to be exculpatory, or is it possible that the judge in a month or two or a week is going to say case closed?
We don't know right now, and to your point, whether it's exculpatory or not, the judge is keeping it under lock and key, likely until that other information from the discovery inquiry comes in. But keep in mind, even if the duct tape, there's great forensic evidence that makes it exculpatory, there's still several steps in between Scott Peterson getting a new trial, because that's just the discovery and the forensic information that's received. Then the Los Angeles Innocence Project has to actually make the motion to overturn the verdict using the results. So there's multiple steps before we actually get to that moment where we find out with finality whether Scott Peterson will actually see the courtroom again.
Does anybody here, I just want to let's take a poll. We were talking about taking a poll, right? Who thinks that Scott Peterson might get another trial?
Oh, yeah, decent amount.
Is there anybody here who thinks Scott Peterson may not have done it? Okay, we've got a couple of hands. Isn't that interesting?
It's very interesting, and you know what, because we talk about this case all the time, we come across other analysts who feel the same way. You've obviously done the reporting. You know that there's an alternative theory out there.
There is.
That people are very passionate about.
Very passionate about. We've interviewed multiple lawyers who say there is no way he did it. And that's crazy when you watch the evidence and you look at all of the tapes with Scott Peterson and Amber Frey and all of that. But that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that with me. Any other questions? Oh, I'll go right here.
I was wondering if we on two different things. The first is the voicemail that was left to Laci when Scott was apparently meeting his children. And the second is the statement he made to Amber saying that this was the first Christmas.
Right. Yeah. That's.
Yeah, and she asked it. So there was a part in the story where Scott Peterson tells Amber Frey, the woman that he's dating, that he had recently lost his wife because he was going to be busted. The friends, Sean Sibley, who set up Amber and Scott, said, "I know that you're married. I'm going to tell her if you don't." And he said, "I've got an explanation. Hold on." And he said, "I recently lost my wife." And Amber, you can hear it in all the documentaries and in the testimony, she says, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to pry. I didn't really know what was going on. I wanted to be supportive." But that was his. And then she later asked him, once she found out that Laci was missing, "You just said that you lost your wife in early December and she wasn't lost yet. What's up with that?" He said, "I can explain that later." But we never got to later with that.
And when you hear that, and then it's one thing, okay, you've got someone who's cheating and tells a horrific lie. It's another thing when your wife ends up dead.
Yes.
Right?
And your point and your question about the voicemail that he left. So he leaves the fishing trip. He's leaving Berkeley Marina. He calls Laci's phone, or maybe it's the house. He leaves a voicemail message saying, "Hey, I'm on my sweetie, beauty. I'm on my way home. I'm going to pick up that gift basket for Papa." And he sounds awfully friendly and jovial. It's really weird. But maybe that's the way they spoke, and that's what he said. He said, "We were very loving, and that was our relationship," but that was him, prosecutors say, leaving an alibi. That's what he was doing. Okay.
Do you think that any of this would have happened without his sister-in-law becoming an attorney? She has been just so, basically a dog is a
Yeah. Maybe. I think the LA Innocence Project, who knows if he would have appealed to them directly without her help, and I believe that she was involved in connecting the LA Innocence Project with the case. But they may have taken it up.
We've seen so many cases that because of an adamant family member or more media attention, which she certainly put the case more media attention than maybe it would have given its age, we've seen that, okay, that can actually garner some results and there will be another look. And to your point, the LA Innocence Project, they could have taken it up on their own, but it certainly helps to have it being laid out for them so that they can now take their resources and move forward with these applications.
That's right.
Thank you so much to Laura and Misty. This was amazing.
Thank you. Thank you guys very much for listening in. We both have social media. You can reach us, and we'll be around for the rest of the day as well. Thank you guys so much for coming. Appreciate it.